My name is Laura Whitmore. For years, I've been the unwilling punchline in my husband's endless collection of jokes. It wasn't just harmless teasing. No, every laugh he pulled from a crowd was carved out of my dignity. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It started at a dinner party in our home. Soft jazz in the background, the smell of rosemary roast drifting from the kitchen wine glasses glowing under the chandelier. I had spent the entire day cooking, arranging flowers, and making everything perfect. By the time our guests arrived, I was already flushed from the heat of the oven but proud of how everything looked. And then, it happened. Halfway through the meal, someone complimented the beef tenderloin. I smiled, ready to thank them, but my husband Michael leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Oh, you should have seen Laura's first attempt at cooking steak when we were dating," he said, shaking his head like a man about to deliver a blockbuster joke. It was so raw the cow could have stood up and walked away. The table erupted in laughter. Even I forced a smile because that's what you do when you're the fun wife, right? But inside my stomach turned. I hadn't thought about that moment in years, and the truth was, the steak had been undercooked because his oven was broken, and he hadn't bothered to tell me. I felt the sting not from the memory, but from the way he was looking at me, triumphant like he'd just scored points in some invisible game. And his friends, they weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me. Michael didn't stop there. As dessert was served, he launched into another funny story this time, about how I once tripped on the stairs carrying laundry, sending clothes flying everywhere. She looked like a raccoon in headlights. He chuckled, and the laughter came again louder this time. I noticed the way people looked at me, not unkindly, but with that faint smile you give when someone is painted as a little bit foolish. Harmless, maybe. Silly, perhaps. But never someone to take entirely seriously. And I knew in that moment it wasn't about humor. It was about control. When everyone left that night, I was clearing dishes when Michael came up behind me, kissed my cheek, and said, "See, everyone had a great time. You really know how to make people laugh." I didn't answer, because I was beginning to understand something I hadn't dared to before my husband didn't tell these stories to connect with people. He told them to put me in a smaller box to keep me there, and to make sure I never forgot my place in his show. That night, lying awake beside his steady breathing, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if every laugh comes at my expense. What happens if I take the laughter away? The thing about jokes is that they're rarely born out of thin air. They need fuel, a memory, a mishap, some imperfection to keep alive and retell. And Michael, he had a whole library. It wasn't as though it happened overnight. When we first met, he'd tease me about little things, how I mixed up directions, how I once wore mismatched socks. Back then, it felt light-hearted, a way of being close. But over the years, those small, innocent moments transformed into something darker, sharper. It wasn't just once or twice. It was always. At his office holiday party, while everyone was sipping champagne, he leaned over to his colleague and said, "Laura, here can't tell the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. I swear she'd try to hammer in a screw if you let her." The room chuckled. I smiled faintly, wishing I could disappear into my glass. At our son's soccer game, chatting with other parents, he said Laura's idea of cheering is accidentally yelling for the other team. She's our family's comic relief. People laughed. I forced another smile. It happened so often the reflex became automatic. Hear the joke, smile, politely swallow the sting. And over time, something worse settled in a quiet, creeping shame. One afternoon, I met my friend Hannah for coffee. We'd been friends since college, and she had that kind of sharp, no-nonsense personality that could cut through any pretense. "How are you really?" she asked after I told her the usual, "Oh, busy but good" spiel. "I'm fine," I said automatically. Then without thinking, I added Michael's been telling more of his stories again. Her brow furrowed. Stories. You mean the ones about you? I nodded, stirring my latte even though it didn't need stirring. Yeah. It's stupid, I know. Just jokes. She leaned in. Laura, they're not jokes if they make you feel small. That sentence lodged itself in my chest. It made me think about all the times I'd tried to bring it up with Michael. Every single time it ended the same way. You're too sensitive. It's just a laugh, relax. You know I love you, I wouldn't joke if I didn't. Each response a little wall built brick by brick, making it harder for me to question him without looking like the problem. One night, after a particularly humiliating dinner with his business partners, where he recounted a 3-year-old incident involving me spilling wine on a client, I lay awake replaying it all. And I realized something chilling. I had stopped telling my own stories. At gatherings, I stayed quiet, careful, as though speaking too much might give him fresh material to twist into comedy. I was censoring myself in my own life, preemptively shrinking so there was less for him to use. That thought kept me awake for hours. And with every minute that passed, anger slowly replaced the shame. The thing is, Michael wasn't cruel in the ways people expect cruelty. There were no yelling matches, no slamming doors. He didn't insult me directly when we were alone. No. He did it with charm wrapped in smiles so no one else would suspect it was anything but good fun. And because of that, I never looked like the victim. I looked like the smiling, supportive wife sitting beside him while he used me as his prop. There's a special kind of loneliness in knowing that if you tell someone about your hurt, they might laugh because they don't see the poison in the punchline. One day, after his latest jab at a family barbecue, something about my legendary inability to parallel park, I caught a glimpse of my daughter Emily watching me. She's 16, old enough to understand subtext. And the look on her face wasn't amusement. It was pity. That was worse than anything else. Because in that second I realized my daughter was learning something dangerous, that it was normal for a man to whittle down a woman's dignity piece by piece, as long as he smiled while doing it. I couldn't let that lesson take root in her. But here's the trap: in situations like this, you start to wonder if maybe it's not bad enough to act. There's no screaming, no bruises, no obvious cruelty, just small humiliations stacked so high they block out the sunlight. And so for years, I told myself I could live with it. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But that night, after seeing Emily's face, I felt the first spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time: defiance. I decided to stop measuring bad enough. I decided that if something made me feel small, it was already bad enough. Michael's pattern was predictable. He saved his best material for groups, friends, family, colleagues. He fed on their laughter. Without an audience, the jokes were rare. That meant if I wanted to change things, I couldn't just argue with him in private. No, I'd have to change the audience. But first, I needed to see the full scope of the problem. So I started taking mental notes. When did he do it? Who was there? How did people react? I found that it was never random. If we were with people he wanted to impress, the stories became sharper, more humiliating. If the group was mixed people I knew and people he knew, he leaned on anecdotes that made him seem clever and me seem naive. And the worse the story made me look, the better he told it. About a month into my little observation project, we attended a charity auction. I wore a navy gown I'd been saving for a special occasion. Michael introduced me to a man who I later found out was a potential investor for his latest business idea. And right there in front of him, Michael said, "Laura's great with design, but don't ask her to handle the finances. She once forgot to pay our electric bill for 2 months." It wasn't true the late bill had been his responsibility, but the room laughed, including the investor. That was when I knew. This wasn't about random slips into bad taste. It was about status. Every time he chipped away at me, he added to himself. In his mind, my flaws made him look smarter, more capable, more in control. That night, as we drove home, he hummed along to the radio like nothing had happened. I sat in the passenger seat looking out at the dark streets and thought, if every joke needs an audience, what happens when the audience stops laughing? That was the moment the plan began to form. I didn't want to scream or cry or beg him to stop. That would only feed his narrative, the overly sensitive wife. No, I wanted him to feel the silence, to know that his words no longer landed, to strip away the stage he had built for himself on my back. And the first step I decided would be to make sure he wasn't the only one telling stories. By the end of that week, I started making subtle changes. I spoke up more at gatherings, sharing my own stories before he could hijack the conversation. I found small ways to shift the topic if he tried to bring up an old funny memory. And when he did slip one in, I laughed lightly, then added a detail that flipped the whole story in my favor. It was small at first, but the shift was there. People began looking at me differently, not as the quiet woman sitting beside him, but as someone who could speak for herself. Michael didn't seem to notice yet, but I knew he would. And when he did, that would only be the beginning. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon in early spring. The air was crisp, the sun sharp against the pale sky, and our backyard smelled faintly of the lilacs I'd planted years ago. We were hosting a small family gathering: his mother, his younger sister, our kids, and a few cousins. It should have been harmless. Just grilled chicken potato salad and the comfort of familiar faces. But Michael had a way of turning the most innocent setting into a stage. We were seated in a loose circle of lawn chairs. Emily was sprawled on a blanket, scrolling through her phone. Our son Ben was tossing a ball back and forth with one of the cousins. The conversation was light warm, until Michael cleared his throat. "You know," he began, glancing at his mother with that mischievous glint in his eyes. "Mom, you'd love this. Remember the time Laura tried to fix the leaky faucet?" My stomach sank. I knew where this was going. She turned off the wrong valve and ended up flooding the entire kitchen. Water everywhere. She just stood there holding the wrench like she'd discovered a new species. Laughter burst from the group, loud and unrestrained. Even his mother chuckled, shaking her head. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. But what hurt wasn't just the story, it was the way he looked at me as the laughter swelled. Not lovingly, not playfully, but like a man who had just scored a point in some invisible competition I never agreed to join. And then I saw Emily. She wasn't laughing. She was staring at me again the same way she had at the barbecue weeks before, with quiet pity. Something in me snapped. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze. I served drinks, cleaned up plates, and kept my voice calm. But inside, my thoughts were sharp and deliberate. I realized in that moment I was done being polite. I was done protecting Michael's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. The most dangerous thing for a man like him isn't being yelled at, it's being denied the audience. And I decided that day he would lose his. That night, after the last guest left and the dishwasher hummed in the background, I told him I was going to bed early. Instead, I sat at my desk in the corner of our bedroom, opened a blank notebook, and started writing. I listed every instance I could remember, every time he'd turned me into a joke. Where we were, who was there, what he said, and how people reacted. The list grew quickly. The more I wrote, the more I saw the pattern, always in groups. Often when there were new people to impress. The jokes were never about his mistakes, only mine. By the time I put my pen down, I wasn't just hurt. I was strategic. Over the next week, I began preparing. My plan had 3 parts. First, I would reclaim my voice. That meant speaking up at gatherings before he could, weaving my own stories with confidence and humor, but humor that didn't come at anyone's expense. Second, I would start building alliances quietly. Friends, family, even casual acquaintances, people who with just a few well-placed truths could begin to see the reality behind his playfulness. And third, I would wait for the right moment. The moment where one of his jokes would fall flat. Not because I told him to stop, but because everyone else finally saw it for what it was. The first test came sooner than I expected. A week later, we were at a neighbor's house for a small dinner. Halfway through the evening, Michael tried to retell the story of the legendary wine spill at his business dinner years ago. As he began, I leaned forward and said lightly, "Oh, that one. The one where you knocked the waiter's elbow and blamed me so your client wouldn't see it was you." The table went silent for half a beat, then erupted into laughter. But this time, it wasn't at me. Michael chuckled along, but I could see the flicker of confusion in his eyes. It was the first time someone had laughed at his part of the story instead of mine. Over the next few weeks, I kept doing it. Every time he told a story about me, I'd gently correct the details in a way that shifted the joke onto him. Not cruelly, not aggressively, just enough to make people see the cracks. And it worked. I noticed people started glancing at me when he began a story, waiting to hear my version. They were beginning to see me as an equal storyteller, not the butt of the joke. But the real breaking point, the one that turned the tide for good, came a month later at his company's summer networking event. It was held at a rooftop bar, fairy lights strung overhead, the city skyline glowing in the distance. Everyone was dressed sharp, glasses of champagne in hand. This was Michael's natural habitat, a place where he could shine. Halfway through the night, he gathered a small circle of people and began, "You'll love this. Laura once tried to surprise me by painting the living room. She picked this awful shade of yellow, and I had to repaint the whole thing the next day." I smiled, sipped my drink, and said, "You mean the shade the client picked? The one you praised as perfect when you thought it was your idea?" The group laughed, but not the easy, indulgent laugh he was used to. This one had an edge. And in that moment, I saw it. That tiny hesitation in his eyes. The awareness that maybe his grip on the room wasn't as tight as he thought. When we got home that night, he was unusually quiet. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Because for the first time in years, I felt the balance shift. The man who had built his charm on making me small was starting to realize I wasn't going to shrink anymore. And that, I thought as I hung up, my dress was just the beginning. After the rooftop event, I could sense a shift in Michael's, subtle but there. The way he paused before speaking in front of others. The slight glance in my direction, as if checking my expression before delivering one of his crowd pleasers. It wasn't victory yet. It was a tremor, a warning sign in his confidence. But I knew better than to get comfortable. Men like Michael didn't change out of remorse, they adapted. And I couldn't afford to let my guard down, not now when the balance was finally beginning to tilt. So I decided to make observation my weapon. I'd always thought of myself as an interior designer who paid attention to details, the way a space felt, how light touched a wall, how people moved through a room. Now I applied that same precision to studying him. When did he choose to take a jab? What kind of people made him bolder? When did he hold back? I kept mental notes everywhere we went. I noticed, for instance, that he was more likely to poke fun at me when the group was mostly men, especially if they were older or wealthier. Around women, particularly confident, assertive women, he was more cautious. It was as though he knew his style of humor wouldn't land as easily in that crowd. And when the audience was mixed, he adjusted the punchline depending on who he wanted to impress. If there was someone he admired, he made the story sharper. If there was someone he disliked, the joke became more self-deprecating, as if to win their favor. I also began to note his tells. There was the way his hand would casually slide into his pocket before launching into a story, a little performance tick that signaled he was about to start. The way his voice dipped slightly lower when setting up the funny part, as if drawing people in. And the way he'd glance sideways at me during the punchline, gauging my reaction. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The more I studied him, the more I realized something important. Michael didn't just feed off my embarrassment, he fed off the collective validation of others. The laughter was his drug, and the stories about me were his surest supply. If I could interrupt the supply, make the laughter uncertain, fractured, hesitant, I could weaken his grip. But to do that, I needed allies. The opportunity came at a small dinner party hosted by our mutual friends, Claire and Daniel. The four of us had known each other for years, and I suspected Claire had noticed Michael's humor at my expense, but had never said anything. Halfway through the evening, Michael began telling a familiar story about the time I supposedly got lost driving to a wedding and ended up in the wrong town. And she's on the phone telling me she sees a church with a red roof, he said, chuckling, but it was a fire station. I laughed softly and said, "Well, if you'd written down the correct address instead of relying on your memory, I might have made it there on time." Claire burst out laughing, not at me, but at him. "Michael, I knew you were bad with directions, but wow. The moment was small, but it was like turning a key in a lock." I caught Claire's eye, and in that silent exchange, I knew she'd understood. Over the next few weeks, I made sure to position myself near the people most likely to support me during social gatherings. It wasn't about ganging up on him, it was about creating a shift in the room's dynamics. When he tried to joke, I wasn't isolated anymore. There were nods, knowing smiles, even the occasional playful jab back at him from others. Slowly, the laughter he counted on began to feel different. Not cruel, not mean-spirited, just lacking the easy, unthinking energy he'd once commanded. Then came the fundraiser gala, the perfect stage for him, and the perfect test for me. The room was full of polished smiles, soft lighting, and the clink of wine glasses. Michael was in his element, charming donors and schmoozing board members. We ended up in a small circle with two older businessmen and their wives. Right on cue, Michael began. "You'll love this. Laura once tried to install a ceiling fan on her own. Before he could finish, I stepped in. And it worked perfectly," I said with a smile. "Until you flipped the wrong breaker and nearly electrocuted yourself." The wives laughed. One of the men chuckled. The other raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Michael smiled, but it was tight around the edges. I could see it, that flicker of uncertainty, the faint narrowing of his eyes. He wasn't used to losing control of the narrative. At home that night, he made a half-hearted comment about me ruining his story. I just tilted my head and said, "Oh, I didn't know it was a competition." He didn't have a comeback. The weeks rolled on, and with every event the balance shifted further. His stories became less frequent, his delivery less confident. But I wasn't naive. I knew men like him didn't just stop because they lost a little momentum. They stopped when something made it impossible to continue. That something was still coming. I could feel it. So I kept watching. Every gesture, every glance, every change in tone. Because the more I understood his rhythm, the easier it would be to break it entirely. And when I finally made my move, there'd be no going back. I'd been chipping away at Michael's little empire of laughter for weeks, slowly cutting off his supply. The hesitation in his eyes was growing, but the jokes hadn't stopped entirely. Part of me, the part that still remembered when we were in love, wondered if there was a chance to fix this without turning it into a quiet war. So one Tuesday night after dinner, I decided to try something I hadn't in years: talk to him. Just the two of us. No audience, no laughter to hide behind. We were in the kitchen, the smell of garlic and roast chicken still lingering in the air. I was loading the dishwasher and he was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone. "Michael," I said, my voice calm, almost casual. "Can we talk for a minute?" He glanced up, eyebrow raised. "About what?" "About the way you tell those stories about me in front of people." He smirked instantly. I saw it happen like muscle memory. "Oh, here we go. The sensitivity police." I took a breath, steadying myself. "I'm serious. I don't mind a joke here and there, but some of the things you say, they're not harmless. They make me look foolish. And they hurt." He chuckled and shook his head. "Laura, it's just humor. You know I don't mean anything by it. People like hearing those stories, it makes them laugh." I know I said choosing my words carefully, but the laughter comes at my expense, and I don't like the way it feels. He set his phone down, leaned forward slightly and said, "Do you want me to stop making people laugh? Is that what you're saying?" There, it was the twist. Make it sound like I was trying to rob him of his charm, his sociability, his very personality. "No," I said evenly. "I want you to stop using me as the punchline." Michael laughed outright, the sound bouncing off the tile. "God, you take everything so seriously. That's your problem. You're too uptight. You've always been like this." The words landed like cold steel. I realized then that I wasn't talking to a man who didn't understand, I was talking to a man who didn't care. It wasn't that he didn't get it. He got it. He just didn't see it as a problem because to him, my discomfort was outweighed by the attention he got from others. And that meant there was no negotiation to be had. No quiet fix. This was about control. And control is never surrendered willingly. That night, as he snored beside me, I stared into the dark and felt something settle inside me, a cold, deliberate resolve. The war I'd been fighting subtly, almost experimentally, became something else entirely. I wasn't just going to chip away at his stage. I was going to dismantle it. The next weekend, we attended a friend's engagement party. It was a warm evening, fairy lights strung across a backyard patio, soft music in the background. I could see Michael scanning the crowd, looking for a place to slip in a story. Sure enough, he found it. Standing with a small group by the drinks table, he began, "Have I ever told you guys about the time Laura—" But I didn't let him finish. "Oh, are you talking about when you locked yourself out of the house and had to climb through the kitchen window in your suit?" I said with a laugh. The group roared. Michael tried to laugh along, but the edge was back in his smile. I started making it a pattern. Every time he took aim at me in public, I countered with a story about him, not cruel, but sharp enough to shift the focus. If he brought up my terrible cooking from years ago, I'd mention the time he burned toast so badly the fire alarm went off. If he joked about my bad sense of direction, I'd tell the story about how he once got lost in our own neighborhood after jogging. The laughter stayed in the room, but it was no longer one-sided. I also started finding ways to draw attention before he could. If I sensed him gearing up for a story, I'd step in with my own, something warm, engaging, maybe a little self-deprecating on my terms. And people responded. They leaned in. They asked me questions. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Michael wasn't the only one holding court anymore. It was around this time that I noticed something interesting when his jokes about me didn't land the way they used to. He would try to make them bigger, exaggerating the details, more raising his voice a little louder. But that only made the shift more obvious to everyone else. It made him look like he was trying too hard. I could see the frustration building in him, the way his eyes darted around when a story didn't get the laugh he expected. And I knew it was only a matter of time before he slipped, before he tried one too many times, and the whole room stopped finding it funny. That moment came a few weeks later at a neighborhood block party. The grill was going, kids were running around. Music floated through the air. We were standing with a group near the food table when Michael, perhaps emboldened by a few beers, launched into an old favorite about me failing to fix a garden hose. Halfway through, I could see the faces around us, polite smiles, but no real amusement. Claire, my quiet ally, gave me the tiniest shake of her head, as if to say, "Don't bother. They already see it." And indeed, when he delivered the punchline, the laughter was lukewarm. A couple of people glanced at me, not with mockery, but with a faint awkwardness, as if they'd just realized they'd been laughing at the wrong thing all these years. That's when I knew my strategy was working. Michael wasn't just losing the audience was beginning to question the act. But I also knew something else I hadn't reached, the moment that would make him stop for good. That moment would have to be something decisive, not just a missed laugh, but a complete collapse of the stage he'd built. And when it came, I planned to make sure he'd never dare step on it again. It happened on a Thursday evening at a charity committee meeting in the back room of a little bistro downtown. I'd been volunteering for the group for years, helping with design layouts for their events. Michael never bothered to attend, but this time he'd offered to pick me up afterward since we had dinner plans nearby. The meeting ended a bit early, so I was sipping coffee with two other women from the committee, Linda and Marianne, when I saw him walk in. Laura Michael called cheerfully, striding over in his usual effortless confidence. I was just telling a friend the other day about your legendary gardening skills. You remember when you planted those flowers and they all died in a week? The words landed like a pebble tossed in water. Not a big splash, but enough to ripple the air in the room. I smiled politely, but before I could speak, Linda, a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense streak, leaned forward. Michael, she said evenly, I don't think it's fair to mock someone for trying something new. At least she plants flowers. Most people don't even try. His smile faltered just slightly. Oh, I'm just joking, he said. I know, Linda replied, still looking at him, but sometimes jokes say more than we realize. The moment passed quickly, but I felt something click into place. For the first time, someone had defended me in real time without me prompting it, and it had landed like a pebble in his shoe. On the drive to dinner, he was quiet. I could feel the weight of Linda's comment hanging between us. I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. Because I knew something important now, I wasn't alone in seeing it. 2 days later, I ran into Linda at the farmer's market. We ended up walking together between stalls, baskets on our arms, and at one point she said, Laura, can I ask you something? Of course. Has Michael always joked about you like that? I hesitated, then decided there was no point in sugarcoating it. Yes. For years. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I thought so. I've seen men like that. They use charm as cover, but there's always a target, and it's usually the person closest to them. There was no judgment in her voice. Just understanding. That conversation planted a seed. Not only did I have allies forming naturally, but I could also cultivate them. From then on, I paid closer attention to the people in our circles who reacted with discomfort to Michael's jokes. You could spot them easily if you knew what to look for. The slight pause before laughing, the glance toward me, the faint crease in their brow. When I saw it, I'd give a small knowing smile or subtly shift the conversation. It built a quiet rapport, nothing overt, just enough to let them know I wasn't oblivious and that I didn't see his humor as harmless. The more I leaned into this, the more I noticed the effect on Michael. At gatherings, he'd tell a story, and instead of the easy rolling laughter he was used to, there would be a flicker of hesitation in the room. People were still polite, but their eyes would sometimes dart to me as if checking my reaction before deciding how to respond. And when I did respond calmly with a small twist to the story that made him the focus, the laugh would turn just slightly in my direction. The change wasn't dramatic at first. Michael probably told himself he was just off his game some nights, but I could see it getting under his skin. One evening at Claire and Daniel's house, he made a crack about my terrible singing voice. I smiled and said, funny, since you were the one belting out Bohemian Rhapsody off-key at 2 in the morning last New Year's. Everyone laughed, especially Daniel, who added, we thought the neighbors were going to call the cops. Michael smiled along, but his hand tightened slightly around his glass. A week later, I got a text from Claire. You know, he's not nearly as quick with the jokes about you anymore. Interesting. That one line made me realize just how much ground I'd gained. This wasn't just about me feeling less humiliated. It was about changing the perception of the people around us. Still, I knew Michael well enough to anticipate that he wouldn't give up entirely without trying to reclaim his footing. And I was right. One Saturday, we were at a friend's birthday party. The music was loud, the drinks were flowing, and I could see that restless gleam in his eyes, the one that meant he was hunting for a moment to shine. He found it when someone mentioned hiking. Oh, Laura, on a trail is a sight, he began. Last time she tripped over a root and went rolling down the hill. I cut in smoothly. And still got there before you, because you stopped every 5 minutes to check your hair in your phone camera. The group laughed genuinely loudly. One woman even said, I like this version better. Michael laughed too, but it was thinner this time. I could almost hear the strain under it. That night, I realized something: the shift wasn't just in other people, it was in me. When I first started this, my responses were calculated, measured to avoid sounding bitter or defensive. Now they came naturally. I no longer feared the moment he'd turn a spotlight on me because I knew I could flip it. The power I'd given away for years was quietly finding its way back. Linda became an unexpected anchor in this process. She'd sometimes pull me aside at events and say things like, "You handled that perfectly," or, "You know he's starting to look predictable." Her insight was steadying. She'd seen this kind of dynamic before, and she understood that the victory wasn't in a single confrontation, it was in slowly shifting the ground under his feet until he couldn't stand comfortably anymore. And that shift was building. The real test, I knew, would be when we were somewhere that mattered to him, somewhere where his image was on the line and where a failed attempt at humor would leave a lasting mark. That opportunity was on the horizon: his firm's upcoming anniversary dinner. If I played it right that night, wouldn't just be another dent in his armor, it would be the crack that finally made the whole facade collapse. The moment Michael mentioned the firm's anniversary dinner, I knew this was it. He'd been talking about it for weeks: the venue, the guest list, the fact that the partners' spouses were invited. It was a black tie event, a mix of clients, investors, and senior staff. For him, it wasn't just another night out. It was a stage. And for me, it was the perfect stage to take away. In the days leading up to it, Michael was almost giddy. He picked up his tux from the tailor, practiced his opening toast in the mirror, and predictably joked about how I'd better keep up with the conversation around his colleagues. I smiled and said nothing, but inside, I was already planning every step. This wasn't going to be about humiliation, not the kind he'd dealt me all these years. No. This was about a shift so clean, so undeniable, that he wouldn't be able to spin it. Step one was appearance. I chose a dress that was striking without being flashy: deep emerald green silk with a high neckline and a slit that showed just enough. I wanted to look like I belonged in every room I entered, not like someone standing in her husband's shadow. Step two was preparation. I made sure I knew who would be there, especially the people Michael would most want to impress. I researched his firm's biggest recent projects, the charity work they'd done, even memorized a few industry jokes and anecdotes. Step three was allies. I let Claire and Linda know I'd be there, and though they weren't attending themselves, they gave me the same advice. Don't aim for the laugh, aim for the respect. The night of the dinner, the ballroom shimmered with warm light. Tables draped in white linens, crystal glasses catching the glow of chandeliers. A small jazz band played in the corner. It smelled faintly of roses and polished wood. Michael walked in beside me, his hand on my lower back, the way he always did in public. A gesture that looked protective, but always felt a little like possession. As we made our way toward the partners' table, I could feel him in performance mode, charming every person we passed, shaking hands, laughing easily. The first hour was harmless enough: wine, hors d'oeuvres, polite conversation. Then came the moment I'd been expecting. We were seated with two of his partners, their spouses, and an older couple who turned out to be one of the firm's biggest investors. It started innocently. One of the investors' wives asked me about my work, and I talked briefly about my design business. That was when Michael jumped in. "Oh, you should hear about Laura's first client," he said, smirking. She showed up at the wrong house and started measuring the living room before realizing she was in the wrong place. I could feel the attention turn to me. I smiled, calm, steady. "That's true," I said lightly, "but what Michael doesn't usually mention is that the client I was supposed to see ended up hiring me to redesign their entire home after I fixed the mix-up, and that project was featured in Interiors Today magazine." The investor's wife's eyes widened. "Really? That's impressive." Michael's smirk faltered just enough for me to notice. From then on, I made sure I was part of every conversation. When someone mentioned the firm's recent pro bono work, I complimented the initiative and added, Michael was so passionate about that project he spent hours on calls at night, even if it meant missing our anniversary dinner. There was a ripple of polite laughter, not mocking but pointed. Michael chuckled along, but his jaw was tighter than before. By the time dessert was served, I had done what I came to do, position myself as someone worth listening to, not someone to be laughed at. And then, the opening I'd been waiting for arrived. Michael, perhaps trying to reclaim his footing, launched into an old favorite, the story about the time I supposedly misread a map and made us late for a wedding. But before he could hit the punchline, one of the partners said, that must have been the same trip where Laura found that incredible little restaurant in the middle of nowhere. You still talk about that place, Michael? I smiled. Yes, the one that ended up catering this very dinner. There was laughter around the table, warm, genuine, and I could feel the shift in the air. Michael had been cut off before the joke could land, and the credit had landed squarely on me instead. On the ride home, he was quiet, staring out the window. You were talkative tonight, he said finally. I guess I just had things to say, I replied. He didn't answer, but I could feel the weight of the night settling in. He'd gone in expecting to shine at my expense. Instead, I'd matched him and in some moments outshone him without ever raising my voice. The thing about men like Michael is they don't crumble all at once. They retreat, reassess, and try again. But something had cracked that night and I knew it. The next time he tried, I'd be ready. And the next time after that. Because this wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about making sure he never forgot that I was no one's punchline again. It was a warm Saturday evening when the chance came almost too perfect to have been planned. Our friends Claire and Daniel were hosting a summer wine tasting night at their house. It wasn't a huge event, maybe 20 people, but it was the kind of crowd Michael thrived on, close enough to feel comfortable, varied enough to impress. As we walked in, I could already see that familiar light in his eyes, the one that meant he was scanning the room for the right moment, the right audience. I didn't need to guess who the target would be. The evening started pleasantly enough. Guests milled about with glasses of deep reds and crisp whites, chatting in small clusters. Claire had set up little tasting stations in her backyard, fairy lights strung across the patio. It was warm, casual, inviting. Michael moved easily from group to group, making small talk, tossing in the occasional joke. I stayed close to Claire and a few others, enjoying the conversation without hovering over him. But I was listening. Always listening. It happened about an hour in. We were all gathered near the largest table sampling a Pinot Noir Claire had been saving for months. Someone made a joke about having too much wine and forgetting where they parked their car. That was all Michael needed. You think that's bad? He said, grinning. Laura once forgot where she parked for 2 days. We had to take an Uber to find her car because she swore it had been stolen. There it was, the setup, the bait. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look at him. I just let the laughter rise, and then cut through it. That's true, I said calmly, but what Michael leaves out is that I was driving his car at the time because he'd left it at the mechanic for a month after trying to fix the brakes himself. The laughter turned instantly louder, richer, and this time aimed squarely at him. Someone even clapped Michael on the shoulder and said, "Guess you won't be joining the pit crew anytime soon." Michael laughed along, but there was that tightening around his eyes again, that split-second flicker of something between annoyance and disbelief. What made it work wasn't just the reversal, it was the timing. I hadn't snapped. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd simply given the room another version of the truth, and they'd chosen mine. And the best part? The laughter didn't feel cruel. It felt like the kind of joke everyone could enjoy, except, of course, the man who had always been the one controlling it. After that, I noticed a subtle change in the way people engaged with us. When Michael started a story about me, a few people would glance at me first, almost expectantly, as though waiting for my version. Sometimes I gave it. Sometimes I didn't need to. Later in the evening, as the group thinned and people settled into smaller conversations, I found myself sitting at a patio table with Daniel and a few others. Michael was across the yard, mid-story, hands gesturing. Daniel leaned toward me and said quietly, "You've been different lately. Stronger. More in the mix." I smiled, just finding my voice. He nodded, but there was something in his expression, a recognition maybe that this was more than just casual banter, that this was about balance. The real turning point of the night came unexpectedly. Someone suggested a game where each person told an embarrassing personal story, and the group voted on the funniest one. Michael's hand shot up instantly. "Oh, I've got a great one about Laura," I cut in smoothly. "And I have a better one about Michael." The group laughed, encouraging me to go first. I told a story true but harmless about how he'd once worn mismatched shoes to a business meeting because he'd dressed in the dark to avoid waking me. I delivered it warmly, making sure it sounded affectionate rather than cutting. By the time I finished, the table was roaring. When Michael tried to follow with his own story about me, the laughter was polite, but it didn't have the same spark. That's when I saw it, the exact moment he realized the shift wasn't temporary. His power in these rooms didn't rest on the stories themselves. It rested on his exclusive right to tell them, and that exclusivity was gone. We left around midnight. In the car, he was unusually quiet for a while, then finally said, "You've been quick lately." I kept my eyes on the road. "I guess I've learned from the best." He let out a short laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. It would have been tempting to feel triumphant, to think the battle was over. But I knew better. Michael wasn't the kind of man to let go of the spotlight easily. If I wanted this shift to last, I couldn't just win here and there. I had to make it so that every time he thought about turning me into a punchline, he hesitated. Because hesitation, I'd learned, was the crack where control leaked out. And my plan to widen that crack was just getting started. In the weeks after Claire and Daniel's wine night, I began noticing something I never thought I'd see Michael holding back. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden transformation into a respectful, self-aware husband. But in those little moments where he'd normally leap into a story about me, there was now a pause, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. The pause was my victory. It first happened at a casual lunch with his colleagues. We were sitting at an outdoor cafe sipping iced tea when one of them joked about their spouse's quirky cooking experiments. I could see Michael's body shift, the lean forward, the glance my way. His mouth opened, then closed again. He reached for his drink instead. That may sound like nothing, but for a man who had built a personality out of those moments, it was monumental. Of course, old habits die hard. 2 nights later, at a neighborhood dinner, he slipped. Someone mentioned hiking, and before I could stop it, he said, "Oh, Laura on a trail is like a sitcom." I tilted my head, smiling just enough. "And yet, I still made it to the top before you last time." The laughter was quick, and not for him. That tightening around his jaw returned, and he let the subject drop. It was becoming a rhythm. He'd start, I'd counter, the room would turn. Each time I could see him retreat a little further into himself. But what fascinated me most was that other people were starting to notice. At a Sunday brunch, Claire leaned over to me after Michael excused himself to take a call and said, "Do you realize he's different now? Quieter, at least when it comes to you?" I did realize, and I knew it was because he was beginning to weigh the risk of telling a joke about me, the risk of losing the room. The real turning point came at a charity auction downtown. It was one of those evenings dripping with polite formality, black dresses, champagne flutes, the soft hum of conversation under the sound of the auctioneer's voice. Michael was in his element again, laughing with a group near the bar working the room. I joined the group just as someone told a lighthearted story about their spouse's disastrous attempt at DIY home repairs. All eyes turned to Michael. It was his opening, and I knew it. He smiled, looked at me, and then shook his head. "No, no, he said with a small laugh. I think I'll keep our home improvement adventures to myself tonight. It was meant to be casual, but I saw the truth in it. He was playing it safe. I didn't press. I didn't gloat. Instead, I simply placed my hand lightly on his arm and said, "Good call." It was subtle, but I knew that moment would stick in his mind the first time he'd censored himself not out of kindness, but out of self-preservation. But as satisfying as it was, I also understood something else. Hesitation wasn't the same as change. If I stopped now, if I let the tension ease, he could slip right back into old habits. So I kept going, not to humiliate him, but to make sure the audience, the one he'd relied on for years, stayed firmly out of his control. A week later, we attended a small dinner party at the home of one of his partners. The table was long candlelit with dishes passed around in that slow, intimate way that makes conversation flow easily. Midway through the evening, someone made a playful comment about how marriage is just a lifetime of collecting embarrassing stories. I felt Michael's eyes on me, testing the air. His lips parted, but I didn't wait for the setup. That's true, I said warmly, though, in our case, most of the good stories involve Michael discovering new ways not to use a toolbox. The table laughed, and one of the partners added, I think we need to invite him over for our next renovation just for the entertainment. Michael smiled thinly, but didn't try to top it. On the drive home, he finally said, You've gotten quick with those comebacks. I've had a lot of practice. I said, meeting his eyes briefly before turning back to the road. He didn't reply, but I could feel his thoughts simmering beside me. The cracks were deepening. Before, he had never considered that the spotlight could turn so easily. Now he thought about it every time. I could see it in the way he sometimes forced a laugh after my counters, the way he occasionally withdrew from the group after an exchange. It wasn't about embarrassing him, it was about making the act unsustainable. And soon I would have my chance to make it unsustainable in a way he couldn't ignore. That chance would come sooner than I expected at an important business dinner, where his joke would not only fall flat, but leave him standing in a silence so heavy it would follow him long after we left the room. And I was already thinking about how to make sure it happened. The invitation came in a crisp white envelope embossed with gold lettering, a formal dinner hosted by one of Michael's most important clients. He was almost boyishly excited when he showed it to me. This is big, he said, tapping the envelope with his finger. They only invite people they actually like. Translation. This was not just dinner. This was another stage. And for me, it was the perfect one to end his act. The night of the dinner, I dressed with the same calculated care I'd used for the firm's anniversary. Sleek black dress hair pinned just enough to look effortless, small diamond earrings. A look that said I was part of the conversation, not an accessory to it. Michael, as always, looked sharp in a tailored suit. But I noticed the way he kept adjusting his tie in the mirror, the little signs of a man wanting everything to be perfect. In the car, he rehearsed a few light anecdotes he thought might loosen the table. I listened without comment, already preparing my own. The venue was an upscale French restaurant with soft amber lighting and white tablecloths, so crisp they looked like they'd been ironed directly on the table. We were seated at a long table near the center of the room, a mix of clients, their spouses, and a few key partners from Michael's firm. The first hour was pleasant enough, champagne appetizers, polite talk about travel and art. I let the conversation wash over me, joining in here and there. Then it happened. The man seated beside Michael mentioned that his wife had recently taken up pottery and how it had led to a few fun disasters. I could see the spark in Michael's eyes before the words even formed. He leaned back, smiling, ready to deliver. You know, he said Laura once, but I didn't let him finish. Redesigned our entire guest room in a single weekend when his client's plans changed last minute, I said smoothly, turning to the man beside him. She pulled 3 18-hour days to get it done, and the client was so impressed they hired her for their second home. The man's eyebrows lifted. Really, that's impressive. Michael hesitated, then gave a short laugh. Not quite the story I was going to tell. I smiled. I'm sure it wasn't. For a moment, the conversation moved on. But I could feel him bristling beside me, his pride pricked, and I knew he wouldn't let it end there. So when dessert came and the table began swapping light-hearted personal stories, I braced myself. Sure enough, Michael leaned forward, his voice just loud enough to draw attention. Okay, here's one. Laura once tried to hang wallpaper on her own. Let's just say it looked like a funhouse when she was done. He delivered the line with a confident grin. He was expecting easy laughter. Instead, the room fell into an awkward quiet. One of the client's wives gave a small, polite smile but didn't laugh. The man beside her cleared his throat. That's not very fair, he said lightly. I can't hang wallpaper to save my life. My wife's much better at that kind of thing. Across the table, someone added, Didn't Laura design that amazing wine room at Claire and Daniel's place? That's one of the best spaces I've ever seen. The conversation swerved away from Michael's punchline straight into a discussion of my work. People began asking me questions: how I'd gotten into design, what inspired me, my favorite projects. And just like that, Michael wasn't in the center anymore. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was worse for him. The silence after his punchline had lasted just long enough for him to feel it, that hollow, uncomfortable space where laughter should have been. And then to have the focus shift not just away from him, but onto me in a positive light. That was the moment. The rest of the evening, he barely spoke. He smiled when expected, clinked glasses when someone toasted, but his usual spark was gone. I kept the conversation flowing with the others, answering their questions, telling stories of my work, none of which came at anyone's expense. By the time we left, I knew. The stage he'd built for years, the one where I was the punchline and he was the star, had collapsed, and it hadn't taken a public fight or a screaming match. Just silence where his applause used to be. In the car, he didn't speak for most of the ride. Then as we neared home, he said quietly, You really took over tonight. I looked out the window, the city lights sliding past. No, I said. I just took my place. He didn't reply, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was driving the conversation, and I didn't intend to hand back the keys. After the business dinner, the shift in Michael was obvious, at least to me. He didn't launch into stories about me as easily anymore. When he did, they were shorter, softer, and often trailed off before the punchline. To most people, it probably looked like nothing more than a change in mood. But I knew the truth. He was testing the air each time, gauging whether the audience would be his ally or mine. And more often than not, they were mine. The following weekend, we hosted a small brunch at our house. It was a casual affair: croissants from the bakery, fresh fruit, mimosas. A few friends, including Claire and Daniel, sat around the kitchen island, while Michael flipped pancakes on the griddle. Someone complimented the kitchen remodel I'd finished last month. Claire added, Laura's got an eye for detail. You should have seen her transform the space. Michael, standing at the stove, hesitated. I saw at that moment when he could have slipped into a story about the time I messed up a paint order, or nearly glued my fingers together during a project. Instead, he flipped a pancake, smiled, and said, Yeah, she's good at what she does. Claire caught my eye across the table, and the corner of her mouth lifted in the smallest, most satisfied smile. But the restraint didn't last forever. A few nights later, we were at another couple's house for dinner. Wine flowed freely. Conversation grew louder. At one point, the host joked about his wife's quirky filing system for paperwork. Michael laughed, looked at me, and started, You think that's bad, Laura? Once I didn't even let him finish. Organized all your tools so you could find them, and then you couldn't find anything because you didn't put them back. The table laughed, the host adding, That sounds exactly like something I'd do. Michael smiled along, but it was tight brittle. That's when I realized something. I'd been playing defense for months, countering his stories, reclaiming my dignity. But now I wanted more than defense. I wanted permanence. You see, I'd learned that change when it comes to someone like Michael is only real if it's reinforced. He could back off for weeks, months even, but if he felt the ground was steady again, he'd go right back to his old tricks. So the question became, how do I make the new dynamic stick? The answer came one afternoon when I ran into Linda at the farmer's market. We wandered the stalls together, chatting about little things until she said, "You know, I've been thinking the way you handle Michael now. It's not just stopping the jokes, it's changing how people see him." I asked her what she meant. People used to laugh without thinking. Now when he makes a crack about you, they pause. And that pause makes them notice. That's the real power, Laura. You've made it so his habit isn't invisible anymore. Her words stuck with me all day. It wasn't just about silencing him. It was about reshaping the room. So I started leaning into that idea. Whenever we were in a group, I made sure my voice was part of the conversation early. Not in a domineering way, just enough to set the tone. I told my own stories, asked thoughtful questions, made others laugh in a way that didn't cost anyone their dignity. It wasn't about being louder than him. It was about making the room mine before he even had the chance to claim it. One of the most telling moments came at a holiday cocktail party. We were standing with a group near the fireplace when someone mentioned funny wedding mishaps. The Michael from 6 months ago would have pounced, dragging out the story of how I supposedly tripped over my dress during our first dance. This time he opened his mouth, then closed it. He took a sip of his drink instead. I saw the calculation in his eyes. And for once, the decision wasn't in my hands, it was in his. And he chose silence. It was satisfying, yes, but also sobering, because I realized that the only reason he was hesitating now was because I'd shown him that the laughter he craved could just as easily turn against him. It wasn't kindness, it was survival. Still, the permanence I wanted wasn't about punishing him endlessly. It was about building a reality where my dignity was untouchable with or without the comebacks. And that meant one final decisive moment, one that would not just make him hesitate, but make him stop. That moment, as fate would have it, would come in the form of a family gathering. A big one, the kind where everyone was there. His siblings, his mother, our kids, aunts, uncles, cousins. The perfect audience for the last act. It was late summer when Michael's mother announced she was hosting a family reunion at her house. The kind with folding tables in the backyard, kids running barefoot on the grass, and relatives you hadn't seen in years showing up with casseroles and stories that had grown taller with time. For Michael, it was a dream audience, people who adored him, who'd grown up with his wit, who wouldn't think twice about laughing at one of his classic Laura tales. For me, it was the perfect setting to end the game. The week before the reunion, I thought a lot about what I wanted that day to look like. This wasn't about embarrassing him in front of his family. That would only breed resentment and make me look petty. No, this had to be clean, controlled, and so final that even he would recognize the pointlessness of trying again. The day came warm and bright. The scent of grilled burgers and sweet corn filled the air. Michael's mother greeted me with her usual warm hug, and we made our way to the backyard where the tables were already buzzing with chatter. I noticed Michael scanning the crowd, moving between groups, laughing easily. I knew the signs. It wouldn't be long before he found the right opening. It happened mid-afternoon. A cluster of us cousin siblings, his mother and my daughter Emily, were sitting under the shade of an old oak tree sipping iced tea. Someone joked about marriage being a collection of shared bloopers. Michael's eyes lit up. I could feel it before he even opened his mouth. "You know," he began. "Laura once," I didn't let him finish. "Yes," I said warmly. "Laura once built an entire bookshelf for Emily's room when Michael said he didn't have the time, and she did it without any help." The group laughed, but not in a mocking way. It was the warm laugh of people genuinely impressed. Emily chimed in. "It's still there." It's my favorite part of my room. Michael chuckled along, but I saw it that brief tightening of his jaw. I'd taken his setup and redirected it into a compliment. A few minutes later, he tried again. We were in a different group this time, his siblings, a few uncles, his mother. He launched into the old story about my famous camping disaster where I'd supposedly forgotten to pack the tent poles. I smiled, then added casually, which was fine because Michael had forgotten to pack the food cooler. The laughter that followed was good-natured but clear. The joke wasn't mine alone to bear anymore. The real moment came an hour later. We were all gathered around for a toast his mother had just finished thanking everyone for coming, and people were in high spirits. Michael, glass in hand, said, "Before we all go, I have to tell this one about Laura." And then he stopped. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't searching for words. It was a choice. He smiled faintly, lowered his glass, and said, "Actually, never mind. I'll save it for another time." The moment was small, almost imperceptible to anyone else. But to me, it was enormous. Because for the first time in our marriage, he'd abandoned a joke about me before it even began, not because I'd cut him off, but because he'd decided it wasn't worth it. The rest of the day was easy. We mingled, played yard games, ate too much dessert. Michael was still social, still charming, but the barbs, even the softened ones, were gone. When we got home that night, we unloaded the car in comfortable silence. I was in the kitchen putting away leftovers when he came in and leaned against the counter. "You've changed the way things are," he said finally. I met his eyes. "No, I just stopped letting you define me with your version of things." He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, as if accepting that a door had closed one he couldn't pry open again. But even as I felt the quiet satisfaction of that victory, I knew there was one more thing I needed to do, not for him, but for me. I needed to set the tone for the future, to make sure this wasn't just the end of his habit, but the beginning of something I could live with. And that meant one more carefully chosen public moment, one that would reinforce in front of people he respected that I was no longer the easy target I'd once been. That moment would come a few weeks later at a gathering we both couldn't avoid, a formal dinner at Claire and Daniel's with a mix of friends, colleagues, and new acquaintances. And this time, I wasn't just going to counter him. I was going to make sure that everyone in the room saw the new rules and understood that they weren't going to change. Claire and Daniel's invitations always felt more like summons than casual get-togethers. Their home was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a glossy magazine, spread open spaces, soft lighting, carefully chosen art. They knew how to put on a dinner that made people feel important. And that was exactly why I knew this would be the right place to close the circle. The guest list would be a mix of old friends, newer acquaintances, and crucially people Michael wanted to impress. In the days leading up to it, I thought about the last family gathering and the moment Michael had stopped himself mid-setup. That choice hadn't been random. It had been the result of months of conditioning, of showing him that his old tricks no longer paid off. Now I needed to make sure that choice stuck. This wasn't about humiliating him. It was about drawing a line so clearly that even he wouldn't dare cross it again. The evening arrived crisp and cool, the kind of autumn night where you could smell wood smoke in the air. I wore a deep sapphire dress, tailored and elegant, with a silver necklace that caught the light whenever I moved. Michael looked good too, he always did, but I noticed he'd been quieter on the drive over, almost contemplative. Claire greeted us warmly, ushering us inside where the dining room table was set, with understated perfection, cream linens, polished silver candles flickering gently. The first hour passed in easy conversation. Guests clustered in the living room, with glasses of wine nibbling on canapes. I made sure to circulate engaging people, directly sharing a few stories about recent design projects. Nothing flashy, nothing overly personal, just enough to establish my presence in the room. Michael stayed mostly in his own cluster, talking to Daniel and a couple of the men from his firm. Dinner was served in courses. By the main, the wine had loosened everyone's voices, laughter bouncing comfortably around the table. That was when someone mentioned the funny misunderstandings that happen when couples work on home projects together. I felt every nerve sharpen. This was prime territory for Michael. And right on cue, he shifted in his seat, glanced at me, and said, "Laura once." I leaned forward, just slightly smiling. "Organized our entire garage in a weekend so you could finally find your fishing gear. And you were so grateful you took me out for dinner." The table laughed warmly, and a woman across from me said, "I wish my husband would do that for me." Michael chuckled along, but I saw it that split second where he'd realized I'd taken control of the story before it even had a chance to turn. The conversation moved on, but my point had been made. I wasn't just waiting to counter him anymore. I was intercepting the ball before it was even thrown. Still, I wanted one more moment, something unmistakable, something that would leave the room remembering my voice, not his. It came during dessert. Someone at the far end of the table asked how Michael and I had met. I smiled. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue. Michael was trying to light the grill and had somehow managed to break the ignition. The table laughed. I continued. I offered to help. And within 10 minutes we had it going, which was great, because otherwise, everyone would have been eating chips for dinner. Daniel grinned. "So you saved the day from the start, huh?" "Pretty much," I said, still smiling, though Michael likes to tell people it was his idea to fix it. We let him believe that for about a week. The laughter was genuine, warm, and most importantly balanced. No one left the table thinking of me as the hapless target of my husband's wit. Michael didn't try again that night. Not once. When we said our goodbyes and stepped out into the cool air, he was quiet as we walked to the car. I waited until we were on the road before I spoke. "That," I said softly, "is how I want things to be. You can tell stories, I can tell stories, and neither of us has to be the punchline." He glanced at me briefly, then back at the road. I think I got the message. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. Because I knew from the way he'd held himself at that table, careful, measured, just a little unsure that the stage he'd once ruled was no longer his alone. And the beauty of it was, I hadn't taken it from him out of spite. I'd simply stepped up onto it myself. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew there would be moments in the future where old habits might tempt him. But the difference now was that he'd have to think about it first. And in that pause, that sliver of hesitation was my victory. It was almost a month before the next real test came, a dinner at Michael's sister's house. His family could be a warm bunch, but they had a sharp memory for funny stories. Old tales were dug up and retold as though they'd happened yesterday, often exaggerated for effect. In the past, Michael had thrived in that environment. It was like a reunion tour for his greatest hits at my expense. But this time I was curious. Would the change I'd seen at Claire and Daniel stick, or had it only lasted because he was surrounded by friends instead of family? The evening started the same as always, a mix of noise and comfort. Kids running down the hallway, the smell of roast chicken drifting from the kitchen, bottles of wine being opened on the dining table. Michael's sister Rachel was telling a story about their childhood dog when one of his cousins piped up, "Remember when Michael brought Laura camping for the first time? What a disaster that was." Every head turned toward Michael. It was the perfect setup, the kind of slow-pitch toss he'd once knocked out of the park without hesitation. I watched him. He smiled faintly, took a sip of his drink, and said, "Yeah, I remember. We didn't plan well, but we figured it out." Then he looked at me a beat longer than necessary, as if to signal that he was letting it go. The moment passed without fanfare, but it was louder to me than anything else that night. He'd been handed the ball, and he'd set it down. Later over dinner, his brother teased him about the time he'd locked himself out of his car. Michael laughed and told the story, but he didn't drag me into it, even though the old version included a bit about me not noticing for hours. Instead, he took the full joke on himself. The laughter was easy, and I noticed something remarkable without leaning on me as the punchline he was still getting laughs. Just different ones. At one point, Rachel leaned over and said quietly, "He's changed." I raised an eyebrow. "How so? He's nicer to you." "Not that he wasn't before," she said quickly, "but he doesn't pick at you like he used to." I just smiled. Maybe he's realized there are better stories to tell. After dessert, people drifted into smaller groups, some in the kitchen, others in the living room. I ended up sitting with Emily and a few relatives talking about her college plans. Michael passed by, listening for a moment before joining in with a story about how I'd helped her build a study desk in her room. He told it without sarcasm, without any little twist to make me seem foolish. It was nice. And I realized that while I had been fighting for my dignity all this time, I hadn't expected to get moments like this in return. When we finally headed home, the night air was cool and quiet. Michael drove in silence for a few minutes, then said, "You know, I didn't realize how much I used to lean on those stories." I glanced at him, and now he shrugged. "Now I don't need to. Or maybe I just don't want to." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close to one as I thought I'd get, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like I needed more. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the journey from those early dinner parties when I'd smiled through the humiliation to now, where silence could hold more weight than the loudest punchline. It hadn't been quick. It hadn't been easy. But I'd learned something important. You don't always have to shout to change the conversation. Sometimes you just have to make sure your voice is impossible to ignore. The thing about change is that it's rarely marked by a grand cinematic moment. It's not a slammed door or a shouted confession. It's quiet, subtle. It's in the space where something would have happened and doesn't. For years, Michael had filled those spaces with laughter that came at my expense. Now those spaces were silent. And for me, that silence was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The transformation hadn't come overnight. It was months of small corrections, subtle reversals, and moments where I refused to play along with the script he'd written for me. I'd learned his rhythms, anticipated his setups, and turned the punchlines into something else, something that didn't leave me diminished. At first, I did it just to survive, to keep my dignity in the moment. But somewhere along the way, it became something more. I wasn't just stopping him. I was reshaping the way others saw me and the way he saw me too. There were still moments when I caught him weighing a story in his head, deciding whether it was worth telling. That hesitation was my proof. It meant I'd shifted the cost-benefit in his mind. Whatever momentary ego boost he'd get from the laugh wasn't worth the risk of me flipping the story back on him. It wasn't about fear. I didn't want him afraid to speak. It was about respect. One evening, weeks after the dinner at his sister's, we sat on the porch with cups of tea, the late summer air soft around us. Michael was quiet for a while, then said, "You know, you've made me rethink how I talk about people. Not just you, everyone." I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to see if he'd keep going. I used to think telling a story about someone was harmless if it made people laugh, he continued. But I didn't think about how it might feel to be that person. I guess I didn't have to. You always smiled. I smiled, I said evenly, because that's what made it easier for everyone else. But easy for you wasn't the same as okay for me. He nodded slowly. I get that now. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and that was something I never would have gotten if I'd stayed quiet. I realized in that moment that I hadn't just changed him, I'd changed me. I no longer flinched at the idea of him holding court at a gathering. I didn't rehearse in my head what I'd say if he started in on me, because I knew I could hold my own. And maybe that was the real revenge, not that I'd silenced him, but that I'd reclaim myself so fully that I didn't need his silence to feel safe anymore. It's funny when people talk about sweet revenge, they picture something explosive. But mine was built in whispers, sidelong glances, well-placed truths. It was built in the moments where I didn't let him take the spotlight at my expense, in the way I carved out my own space in every room we entered. It was in knowing that the next time he thought about telling one of his stories, he'd feel that split-second pause, and maybe decide not to. If you've ever been the butt of someone else's jokes, you know how it wears on you, how you start to question yourself, how you wonder if maybe you are too sensitive. You're not. And you don't have to make a scene to change the script. Sometimes you just have to step up and start telling your own story. So, to anyone listening who's ever been made small in front of a crowd, take it from me. You can rewrite the ending, you can take back the room without shouting for it, and you can make sure that the only person laughing at you is you. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced something similar, I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if you want more stories like this, stories of quiet victories, unexpected comebacks, and reclaiming your power, subscribe to Grace's Truth and share your own in the comments. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making someone else pay, it's making yourself free.